Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to BookTrek 2021, a Star Trek-centered 5-month mission that I'm on with a bunch of other booktubers where we're talking about Star Trek. We're reading Star Trek for the rest of the year. So all of August has been devoted to the original series, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, NCC 1701, the Enterprise and all of its attendant people. And it was attendant people that we talked about yesterday. I was talking about a book called Renegade. That's a fairly okay book, and one of the major villains in Renegade is Lieutenant Commander Ben Finney, a character from the original show, from the episode Court Martial, a character who has a long history with Jim Kirk that we only know about from that tiny little window in Court Martial. They knew each other for decades, and were close enough friends so that Ben Finney named his daughter, Jamie, after Jim Kirk. Eventually, jealousy over the meteoric shape of Kirk's career drives Finney insane and leads him to want to frame Kirk for murder and have him disgraced and busted out of the service. That's a huge story. We only get one side of it in the episode Court Martial. We don't get any of the rest of it. We don't get any of the immediate fallout. The show ends with the stereotypical 50 minutes in, and we never learn anything more about it. So Ben Finney is left up in the air. We presume that he is not a part of Starfleet anymore. We presume that maybe he'll undergo some sort of incarceration. I don't know. Surely it's a crime to try to frame a Starfleet officer. The book, Renegade, imagines a future for Ben Finney in which he is a sort of a nefarious pawn of the Klingons, both groups of which are working to bring down Jim Kirk. And it was a little mechanistic and not all that interestingly done. And it caused me to opine. A large part of my BookTrek 2021 videos in August have been me opining. It doesn't take much to get me to opine about all things Star Trek. It doesn't take much to do that. We'll see if it holds true with The Next Generation in September. The Next Generation is the iteration of Star Trek that I like the least of the 5 that we're doing in 2021. And it's a wide margin. I really, really like a lot of aspects of Deep Space Nine. And I think that Deep Space Nine might also have a couple of the best single scenes in any iteration of Star Trek, which is a lot to say. Star Trek, the original series, has some of the best lines in any iteration of Star Trek, and it also has the single best episode in the entire run of any iteration of Star Trek. But Deep Space Nine has a lot of great scenes, little set pieces that are just as beautifully done as anything in any other iteration of Star Trek. Same thing with Star Trek Voyager. There's some really, really great character work in Star Trek Voyager. As good or better than anything in any other iteration. But The Next Generation? I don't sense any of that. I don't remember any of that. I've seen all the episodes. I've watched the wretched movies, and I have also read the books. But it's going to be a voyage of into the unknown for me in September. But I mentioned in one of my opinings yesterday, I mentioned how nice it would be if some of these great characters in the original series of Star Trek got their own books. I know that it's unrealistic, but I would like the whole story of Mira Romaine. I would like the whole story of Samuel Cogley, attorney at law. I would like the whole story of Kirk's friendship with Ben Finney, Kirk's friendship with Gary Mitchell, which is over before we even know it began. I'd like the whole story of a lot of these characters, and you don't get it outside of maybe the wilds of fanfiction, where I have not read everything in the fanfiction. Of course, there's way too much. If you just go to fanfiction.net alone and look up Star Trek, you will see. I don't even know what the number is anymore. It must be 250,000 entries, something like that. Some of them with multiple chapters. They've been going on for years now, and there are many other fanfiction sites. I haven't kept up with a fraction of it. So I'm sure that things like that exist. Like, for instance, Miranda Jones. I mentioned Miranda Jones, played by Diana Muldaur. A blind human telepath who is trained on Vulcan. That is an amazing story. We just get a little bit of it. We don't get the whole of it. And these characters do go on in Paramount pocketbook sanctioned fiction after that. Not always to Steve's pleasure. It's not always to Steve's pleasure. Miranda Jones especially is in a recent book in which the writer just expounds on his own idea that Miranda Jones was never actually a telepath, that humans can't be telepaths. When the X-Men tells us they can be. There's a whole convoluted thing there, and the thing about the novels that you don't have refuge to canon, right? If you can't look to any novel and say, well, you did that wrong, because the novels are all extra canon. They're all ex cathedra, so it doesn't. In a way, it doesn't matter what an author does, because another author could come along and say it's completely different. Now, these authors play ball with each other, and tend to be, especially as the years have gone on in the last 15 years, the author of a new Star Trek novel will tend to be worshipfully respectful of the creations of previous authors, which is dangerous, and I don't like that, because that starts to make the whole thing feel like an extended in-club meeting. Oh, you don't know what so-and-so wrote about Uhura's parents 5 books ago in a series you don't read? Well, I'm taking all of my stuff about Uhura from those novels, and I'm not going to explain any of it, so you're really just outside the loop. I don't like that at all. Not only because it's exclusionary, and I don't like that, but also because it's lazy. But once I opined like that on that subject, I started thinking, and I was, at the end of every evening when I'm getting ready to shut everything off and just read all night long, I sort of flash through all of the Star Trek fiction that I have to try and decide on ebook, to try and decide what I'm going to read that night, what I'm going to reread that night. And I was sort of idly thumbing through those, but my opining was in the back of my head while I was doing that, and suddenly I saw what I should have remembered to begin with, which is as close as Star Trek is ever going to come to doing what I described yesterday. These are novels by Greg Cox about Khan Noonien Singh from the original series episode Space Seed, and also from the great Star Trek movie The Wrath of Khan. And Khan would certainly be another character where we only get him for 40 minutes in an episode because you want to know everything about him. In the original series episode Space Seed, the Enterprise encounters the USS Botany Bay, a cryo ship launched from Earth before warp drive was invented. So the crew of the ship are in suspended animation. And they are genetically engineered supermen and women from centuries ago on Earth. And Kirk decides to revive them. In the pure innocence of the 23rd century, he decides to revive them. Because what harm could they possibly want? We live in paradise. They're not Klingons, after all. It turns out they are led by a megalomaniacal Superman named Khan Noonien Singh, played immortally by Ricardo Montalban. And they got Ricardo Montalban to reprise his role in Star Trek II with a fright wig on. And it's delightful. Absolutely delightful. In that episode, we are told that the records of the time when Khan left Earth during what's called the eugenics wars, that the records of those times are sketchy and incomplete. But that as far as Spock can make out, our visitor is Khan Noonien Singh, and his crew are renegade genetic supermen who almost brought the world to the brink of disaster, and now we find them here in the middle of space. And Khan himself, once he starts to talk about himself in the episode, says, on Earth, 300 years ago, I was a prince with power over millions. And he repeats over and over again in the course of the episode that he is genetically engineered to be superior mentally and physically to any human being, any non-engineered human being. We never get, in Space Seed, we never get the thing that fans always wanted. They wanted it right from the beginning, which is, Ricardo Montalban was this big, imposing figure. The dictates of weekly heroic science fiction television means that when there is a physical showdown, and there certainly will be a physical showdown with a character who's saying he's stronger than you are, it'll be between Kirk and Khan. And I wasn't the only fan who was watching that original episode and thinking, oh, come on, come on. I mean, I realize this is the late 60s and the cult of machismo is everywhere, but you have made it clear in the course of this episode that Jim Kirk could not possibly defeat Khan in single combat, that it could not happen. So it's okay if you want to have them have single combat in the engineering section, but you can't have them go just mano a mano. Kirk will simply lose. He has to come up with some other way to do it. Something clever at the last minute, something unexpected, something very Kirk-like. And instead he doesn't. Khan takes his phaser from him and crushes it in his bare hands. A metal phaser. Crushes it in his bare hands. And then he and Kirk fight physically. And the fight rather hilariously shifts immediately to obvious stunt doubles. But even so, Khan throws Kirk all around the engineering room, and then Kirk at one point finds that he has his hands on some sort of plastic nozzle, pulls it out of the bay that it's on, and beats Khan down with it. Beats him in the shoulder, beats him on the back, just keeps beating him while he's down until finally he's unconscious. No, no, that wouldn't work. That wouldn't work at all. In the context you have given us for Space Seed, it wouldn't work at all. A character who can crush a metal phaser can certainly beat Jim Kirk in combat. Just, you have to think no further than the original series episode, This Side of Paradise, where Kirk knows that he has to enrage Mr. Spock in order to save the ship and his crew, and he intentionally goes into the conflict with a metal pipe, not a plastic nozzle, but a metal pipe. He doesn't find it by accident. He goes into it with that pipe and is easily defeated. Easily. It takes a second for Spock to destroy the thing and get rid of it. Any physical fight between Khan and Kirk would have been the exact same way. Fans knew that when that episode aired, and a lot of fans also really wanted to know how Mr. Spock would have done against Khan Noonien Singh himself. That never happens, of course. Scotty gets in a punch at one of the Supermen. Just a random punch, but we never learn anything more than that. And that episode is a perfect example of what I was talking about, and Greg Cox wrote the book. He wrote the book that I'm talking about. Now, this is The Rise and Fall of Khan Noonien Singh. This is Eugenics Wars. That's part 1. But here, let me get the Star Trek datapad to behave itself. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's a little sluggish. There was also a part 2. This was a 2-part novel. I don't think there was a 3rd part. Let's see. Oh, goodness gracious. Well, anyway, while I'm doing this, I can be palavering either way. Greg Cox decided, yeah, there was a part 2. And that is the USS Botany Bay taking off. And these novels start when Khan is just a little boy at a eugenics experimental laboratory in India. They start the first one starts when he's just a little boy. And the eugenics experiments that are being done on these children to make them super beings has come to the attention of another character who deserves a whole novel of his own, Gary Seven, from the original series episode Assignment Earth, that was meant to be a sort of a trial run for a spin-off show about Gary Seven, with Terry Garr as his assistant and a black cat named Isis as his colleague. Gary Seven is a perfect fit for a novel about a eugenically engineered Superman, or a group of them, because the little that Gary Seven tells us in Assignment Earth about his origin is that he is a descendant of humans that were taken from Earth centuries ago by aliens from a distant solar system. The whole solar system is cloaked. No one knows it's there, presumably not even in Federation times. And on that planet, the descendants of those humans were raised and trained to be operatives on worlds that are in a difficult transitional period in order to help them along, in order to help them not self-destruct. That is why Gary Seven is operating on Earth in the Kennedy-era space age, because he's trying to stop humanity from making crucial mistakes. And he has all sorts of advanced technology at his disposal. A transporter booth, something that acts a lot like the sonic screwdriver. It's a really good episode. It's really, really enjoyable. I'm not sure how good the series would have been. But the reason why Gary Seven is a perfect match for the story of Khan is because Gary Seven is, by any definition, eugenically engineered. He is from a captive, watched, and monitored population of humans on a world where there are no other humans. So he is a perfect example of a character you want to haul into this story. And it's fascinating because it's him and his assistants. We learn in the course of this book and the sequel through illusions only. Greg Cox never actually elucidates anything. From illusions only, we learn from the three of them that they have had that spin-off series. It just wasn't on TV. It was in Greg Cox's imagination. They've had many, many adventures, both in the world and outside the world in different dimensions. We don't learn any of them, but they are alluded to heavily. And Gary Seven doesn't want there to be a secret eugenics laboratory in India. He doesn't want that to happen. He wants to thwart that from being true, because he has observed, as he tells us, and as the narrative tells us, he's observed many times that tampering with eugenics only ends badly for any species that tries it. He mentions a number of those species, including the Borg. And the book takes place in the 1960s, and then it moves to the 1970s, and then it moves to the 1980s, and we just go through this whole panoply of 20th century history with the eugenics wars laid down alongside it. In the author's note at the end of either book 1 or book 2, I forget which one it is, Greg Cox says not that he's talking about an alternate history, but that he doubts that, considering all the stuff that was going on in Vietnam and Korea and the nuclear arms race and the crisis in the Balkans and whatnot, he doubts that most of the world would even have noticed that the eugenics wars was going on. He doesn't say it's an alternate universe. He says it happened. It just, no one noticed. It was off the headlines. And we meet a young Khan Noonien Singh, and we follow him as he gets older. And when he is a boy and then a rebellious teenager, he's sort of in a student-mentor relationship with Gary Seven. It's kind of fascinating. Kind of fascinating the way it's done. And at one point, when Khan is breaking away from Gary Seven's moral control, and you want to come up here? Come on, baby. That's sweet. And starting to exhibit some of the bloodthirsty nature that we see in Space Seed. At one point, they are in a secret Antarctic laboratory of a nefarious figure named Dr. Evergreen, who is developing the technology to open and close holes in the ozone layer. These books are absolutely replete with historical allusions. Tonya Harding, Ronald Reagan, Jaws, Rambo, commercials, you name it. They're all over the pages of these books, just all over them. You could actually get an annotated edition of these two books if you put them together as one volume. They're confronting this Professor Evergreen in the Antarctic, and Gary Seven is grappling with him. Occasionally, Gary Seven is he's portrayed here as a fairly reserved, intellectual, and elegant administrator. He'll get his hands dirty, but he'd prefer not to. And he is, we're told, has quote-unquote parahuman strength. He's not completely human anymore. And he's grappling with this scientist in the Antarctic and sort of wondering to himself, why is this guy so hard for me to grapple with? What is going on here? Why is this scientist suddenly so formidable? And while he's grappling with him, the teenage Khan takes out a knife and hurls it straight into the guy's throat. Professor Evergreen's throat, to kill him. Gary Seven is horrified. The man pitches to the snow, and Gary Seven starts to lecture Khan about how that absolutely wasn't necessary. You are not to kill. And while they're in the middle of arguing about it, Evergreen recovers. He coughs and takes the knife out of his throat, gets back up, dusts himself off, because he is another callback character from the original series, Flint from Requiem for Methuselah, one of my favorite Star Trek episodes. A human who realized 6,000 years ago that he was immortal, that he could be killed, he could receive a mortal injury and still live. In the Antarctic, Gary Seven and teenage Khan Noonien Singh encounter Evergreen, who will become Flint, and who's working on this technology about the ozone layer. And the story wanders in and out of that kind of continuity endlessly, just endlessly. There are so many Easter eggs in this book and the second book. I lost count of how many. So many of them. And in other words, these two books, probably they will work a lot better for Star Trek fans than for non-Star Trek fans. there's a lot of history in here. There's a lot of stuff like that. And since we watch everything, we watch Khan from boyhood to adulthood, from boyhood to Blastoff. There is a through narrative that might be able to hold on to a non-Star Trek reader, but oh my God, the Easter eggs are enormous. There's Mr. Evergreen who mentions at one point when he's recovered and he's talking about his science with Gary Seven, says that maybe he really needs to be less naive and take on a more flinty persona. And his name eventually, centuries later, is Mr. Flint. At one point, we meet an enterprising engineer named Shannon O'Donnell. Voyager fans will recognize Shannon O'Donnell as an ancestor of Catherine Janeway. And on and on and on it goes. But there's a scene at one point, the point that I'm describing, where an adventure happens that stars Flint, Gary Seven, and Khan. That's just awesome. That's just incredible. The reason why we get all of this history is because there is a regular plot to these two books. They are not a pure example of what I'm talking about. The Enterprise, under Kirk and Spock and McCoy, have been sent to a planet that heavily indulges in eugenic engineering. The Federation has wondered, they've sort of wondered at the highest levels, if maybe they ought to rescind their centuries-old law against genetic tampering of humans. That maybe they ought to do that, because the two major species that they've encountered who are hostile are Romulans and Klingons, both of which are physically superior to humans in one-on-one match, with no technology. McCoy is horrified at this. He says it's our oldest rule for a reason. But Kirk has to wonder. He has to keep an open mind. So they go to this planet, and before they get there, Spock suggests that Kirk read up on the story of Khan, who they've already met and bested, and haven't met again. And so Kirk does, and that is the sort of the framework. When he gets to the planet Sycorax, he meets not only the genetically engineered inhabitants of that planet, but also Captain Koloth of the Klingons, who are also interested in genetic engineering. So there is a conventional Star Trek story that sort of frames all of this. But the huge bulk of it is the story of Khan growing up and feeling more and more certain that he needs to rule the Earth in order to improve it. And Gary Seven slowly aging over time. He isn't immortal like Flint. So Gary Seven constantly opposing him. There are some hijinks, James Bond adventures. There are ups and downs. The heroes lose and win. Roberta Lincoln, his assistant, and he are in all sorts of hair's breadth adventures. They meet all sorts of people. They hear all sorts of rumors about people named Ferengi who were found at Roswell, or about a Russian operative who was found on board the Navy vessel, the USS Enterprise. His name was Pavel Chekhov. And although he got away, he left behind these weird little instruments, and we've been trying to make sense of them. All kinds of callbacks like that. At one point, Roberta Lincoln, when she's under a pseudonym at a science conference, meets a young marine biologist named Gillian Taylor, who is going to be the main character in Star Trek 6 or Star Trek 4, The Voyage Home. And already in the book, she's interested in marine biology. So you get all sorts of Easter egg call-outs like that as you watch the rise of Khan. That goes from this book. Am I going to be able to get the Star Trek datapad to behave? It's kind of sluggish. It doesn't. I've noticed that when I give it commands, it doesn't just bounce from one command to the next. And at first, spoiled by my bigger and newer iPads, I was bothered by that. And then I thought, well, I only want to read this on this thing. I want to read on this thing, and maybe Voxer on this thing once in a while, but I mostly read. So I don't need it to bounce all around. I don't need it to be extra fast. As you can see, this takes us all the way to the end, when Khan is contemplating unleashing a horrible toxin on the whole world. Better to destroy it than not to rule it. When Gary Seven presents him with an alternative, there is an experimental cryo sleeper ship on a launch pad. You and your people can get on it and go find new worlds to conquer. And Khan decides to make that decision, and is never an entirely unsympathetic character. Never in the whole course of this thing. In the course of the two books, the most unsympathetic character is Khan's mother, who we meet in the first book. The only problem that I have with these two books are as close as you're going to get to what I was talking about yesterday. Novels dedicated to fleshing out the stories of people who only show up for 40 minutes in one episode. Khan's not quite that, because he shows up again, but that's after everything, so it doesn't really count towards this story. It's as close as you're going to get. The only problem with these two books is that they are badly executed. Greg Cox is a fun writer, especially the first volume of these two is a really fun book. He crams it full of fun. And Roberta Link, Terry Garr's character, is a fun character. She's never totally serious. Gary Seven is totally serious. He never jokes. But it's fun. The quips, Terry Garr's character doesn't... Roberta Lincoln doesn't like the sentient computer in Gary Seven's office. She especially doesn't like his cat, who is not really a cat, but an alien, and who gets some great scenes in these two books. She doesn't really like those, and she gets off quips about them. She also quips with all the bad guys. She's a fun character to watch through this, as she ages. Until at the end of the second book, when Gary Seven, of course, is thinking about retirement, and she's thinking, well, I'll take over, but I need someone younger to help me with the legwork. And even the someone younger, a young woman named Rain, from a great episode of Star Trek Voyager, a time travel episode of Star Trek Voyager, shows up at the last minute. So Star Trek fans, people who know the television series, are going to see that at the very end of the second book and say, yay, yay, so Rain gets to be involved in these adventures, yay. But the problem is that Gary Cox is a very wooden writer. He's having fun, but he absolutely does not trust you. He does not trust his audience at all. So he is constantly recontextualizing everything. Everything. So Gary Seven, the extraterrestrial operative, we're told at the beginning of one long paragraph, we're told Gary Seven, the extraterrestrial operative. At the end of that paragraph, we're reminded that he's an extraterrestrial operative. At the beginning of the next paragraph, we get some variation on that. Over and over and over and over again. When your readers are reading along page by page, they don't need you to be constantly making sure, not just in every chapter, but in every paragraph, that they're up to speed. I don't know that this is true. I don't know Greg Cox. I have no idea the circumstances under which he wrote these books. But a lot of that looked to me like someone padding to a word count. Totally unnecessary. Totally. And I was reading these. I read these things at first and thought they were boring. They aren't boring. If you're a Star Trek fan, they aren't boring. But reading them the second time, I was thinking, what a book could be made out of this if you took that stuff out. If you took out that is the most damning of authorly tics. If you took it out, these would be great. This would be one great story. I kept imagining, take the two books, get them sweating to the oldies, get them to drop 30% of their body weight and put them in one volume. And just call it The Rise and Fall of Khan Noonien Singh, or just call it Khan. This, like so many books, oh my God, don't get me started. I know, again, I know the peanut gallery is saying, we did get you started, you're self-starting. I can't stand the modern 21st century, I don't think this is 21st century, I think this came out in 2000, but the modern habit of giving books multiple titles, it's especially corrosive in science fiction. It's all over the place. What is the name of this book? The Rise and Fall of Khan Noonien Singh or the Eugenics Wars? I have no idea, and I don't want to know. Both are bad titles. This should be called Khan. It should be just called Khan. If you made one book out of this and you flensed off the flab that Greg Cox adds to this everywhere, add it, keep the great dialogue, keep the great twists and turns, keep all the Easter eggs, but get rid of all of that padding. He began walking down the street. He continued walking down the street. He finished walking down the street and turned the corner. So he was no longer walking down that street. He's now walking down a different street. He began walking down that street. He continued walking down that street. He finished walking that. Oh, ridiculous. So I had a problem with the reading experience, but the meta experience, the content, the fan experience, oh, I loved it. Absolutely loved it. So I got what I wanted. I forgot these things existed. Probably because the prose is forgettable. I forgot these things existed, and these are as close as we're ever going to get. They're a good example of what I'm talking about. So there, you have a little bit of closure from yesterday. God only knows what tomorrow will bring. I'm going to keep doing Star Trek until we run out of August, which we do next Tuesday. This coming Tuesday is the last day in August. So that's Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. That's 3 days. I've got 3 days to cover the rest of the original Star Trek fictional world. One of my co-hosts, Michael K. Vaughn, did his latest video on the Gold Key Star Trek comics that are surreal. They are absolutely surreal. They are really, really bad science fiction, really, really bad comic books, really, really bad artwork, and especially really, really bad Star Trek, unless you take a whole dish full of peyote ahead of time. If you do that, you'll be fine. But that gave me the idea that maybe I want to go a little bit afield, stop dealing with novels for these last 3 days, and deal with adjacent stuff, comics. Or maybe I will, maybe I won't. Who knows? Maybe I'll even add in a favorite of mine just for the thrill, when I'm ever going to get a chance to do that again. When am I going to get another Star Trek event that's concentrating on the original series? That's unlikely to happen again. So maybe I'll talk about a couple of old favorites anyway and just break my own rule, and then we'll move on to the next generation. But it's the original crew until Tuesday. They don't arrive until Tuesday. Never mind. I'm going to wrap this up, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.